Hello, this is Arsenio Paez, and I'm here to tell you about Consider, our framework for guiding intervention fidelity and study design in clinical trials of surgery and complex interventions. By complex interventions, we're referring to practitioner-based interventional treatments. So, for example, surgery, interventional cardiology, physiotherapy, radiotherapies, and these are interventions in which the operator's skill and experience, human factors, interactions between patients and providers, and the need to tailor and adapt treatments to individuals creates unique challenges for clinical trials. For example, identifying the active ingredients of a treatment or intervention, the dosage and whether it's sufficient to deliver the active ingredients, and how much tailoring or adaptation is allowed. We also see that there's poor reporting of details throughout, despite extensions to consorts such as Spirit and Tidier, and that reproducibility and implementation remain difficult. Another underreported aspect of clinical trials in these interventions is intervention fidelity. And this is the degree to which the intervention was delivered in the trial as it was intended in the protocol. When we have high levels of intervention fidelity, it increases our confidence that the outcomes we see are due to the intervention and not to some contaminating variable. When we have high levels of fidelity, it reduces the risk of type 1, 2, and 3 errors, allows us to attribute the outcomes to the intervention itself and not flawed delivery. It decreases the chance of contamination and bias, limits the potential for confounding and random variability, and also increases internal and external validity. An important application of fidelity would also be in the design of placebo and sham interventions, and these tend to be difficult to design for complex intervention trials. And we can use fidelity to move the needle, as it were, between varying levels of fidelity so that we can design interventions that resemble the experimental one but carry no or very low dose of its active ingredients. And we can see guidance for this in frameworks such as DIDO or in the Aspire guidelines for placebo controls in surgical trials to see how fidelity can be used for this. And an interesting example is Seesaw. And in Seesaw, the experimental intervention group receives arthroscopic surgery with bone spur removal in the shoulder, but one of the control groups receives a sham intervention where there is the arthroscopic surgery but no bone spur removal. On the other hand, when we have poor fidelity, we have decreased ability to attribute the outcome of the trial to the intervention itself and not contamination by other variables. And we may also see reduced statistical power. Even a 25% decrease in fidelity requires a 4 times larger sample size to compensate. And this can be challenging in clinical trials of complex interventions, which tend to have smaller sample sizes than pharmaceutical trials, for example. We may also see exaggerated treatment effect sizes. And meta-epidemiological work in our program of research has found that higher levels of fidelity lead to smaller, more precise treatment effect estimates. And this relationship between effect size and fidelity holds even when we control for other factors such as risk of bias and sample size. Although there are many potential benefits to fidelity in clinical trials, it's still poorly planned and reported, despite guidance from Tidier and Spirit and other tools. And there's a great deal of variability among the models and constructs that have been developed. Many of them have been developed for psychology or behavioral medicine or, for example, for public health, but none have been developed specifically for the interventional treatments like surgery and physiotherapy that we're particularly interested in. And there's also very little guidance for fidelity as part of study design as opposed to something that gets evaluated after the trial has completed. There's very little agreement as well about how and what to monitor. So some tools and checklists may have 5 items, while some may have 120 items. To address this gap, we've designed the Consider framework, which stands for Complex Interventions Design, Delivery, and Receipt, and it recommends processes that support and enable fidelity monitoring in clinical trials, but also gives practicable guidance for fidelity planning and implementation in clinical trials, with implications that go beyond just intervention efficacy and also go into the construction of placebo controls and active control interventions. In order to develop Consider, we conducted a systematic review of published and grade literature, searching for fidelity frameworks or models or constructs in methodological or clinical trial papers between 2005 and 2020. And we screened 2,139 papers, of which 130 were included in our qualitative synthesis, representing clinical trials and methodological papers in health and physical activity promotion, rehabilitation, and surgery and post-surgical care. We then used a novel best fit framework synthesis method to take the results of our systematic review and use thematic synthesis and reciprocal translation to create the Consider framework. In order then to improve the applicability and generalizability of our framework, we mapped its items onto the Tidier checklist, which was developed to improve the reporting of interventions within clinical trials. The resulting Consider framework conceptualizes fidelity in three distinct but interrelated components: design, delivery, and receipt. It also gives detailed and practicable guidance for not only planning fidelity procedures and implementation, but monitoring fidelity during the clinical trial. Accompanying the model, we also have the Consider Fidelity Checklist, which is an 8-item checklist that can be used when designing a clinical trial to embed fidelity processes and fidelity monitoring into it, or when reviewing a trial to see what fidelity processes there were or whether fidelity was achieved. And it includes how these items map out onto frameworks and checklists like Tidy or Insert, and how they can be identified. In the design component, we're looking at the core elements of the intervention and its clinical trial. So we're considering the intervention design, the treatment theory, its mechanism of action, and the objects of treatment, but also the active ingredients and the dosage required to deliver them. We're operationalizing the intervention and putting a lot of thought into the core and the flexible components so that we can determine the limits of allowable adaptation during the trial. We're also looking at elements of the study protocol and the treatment manual that will be the guide for the interventionist during the trial, but also the methods for monitoring fidelity during the trial, such as checklists or audits. Importantly, we're looking at the training of the providers, how they are trained to deliver the intervention, but also how we monitor drift to make sure that they maintain a level of skill in delivering the intervention during the trial. In the delivery component, we're looking at how we ensure that the intervention is delivered as was intended in the protocol with fidelity. We're monitoring adherence, we're using customized checklists or frequency counts for behaviors. We're considering tailoring and adaptation, carefully documenting all tailoring and adaptation, which supports the ideal recommendations, and making sure that these stay within our predetermined limits for accommodating participant differences. But we're also monitoring provider competence, how the provider's skill in delivering the intervention during the trial is maintained, either by random sampling of sessions to supervise or by other methods such as video or audio audit of intervention delivery. And finally, in the receipt component, we're looking at the exposure of the participants to the intervention, and this is by looking at their session attendance, their exposure, how much of the dosage they received, their receipt of the core elements of the intervention. We're also looking at the participants' response during the trial, their ability to perform treatment-related skills during the trial for interventions that require it, but also their compliance with the intervention or the trial processes. Importantly, we're also monitoring participant dropout and why this has taken place. So it could be that the dropout has taken place because of things outside of the actual intervention, such as scheduling, but it could also be things related to the intervention itself, such as intervention complexity or side effects, or their comprehension of it. And these are evaluated both during and after the trial. And we believe Consider holds important potential benefits for the practice of evidence-based medicine. It addresses an important gap in complex interventions and fidelity, can help improve the conduct of clinical trials, and also facilitate reproducibility and implementation into clinical practice, helping to reduce research waste. Importantly, it can facilitate more accurate estimates of treatment effects, which has important implications for meta-analyses, systematic reviews, and the evidence-based practice guidelines that derive from them, and it supports the mission of the ideal framework. If you'd like to know more about Consider and intervention fidelity in complex interventions, email me, and watch this space. Look out for our publication.